Hello, in this video you'll learn how to set up checkout with Revolut using the merchant API in Blazor server in this case. You'll learn how to handle the webhooks, how to set up secrets and all the other arrangements that are needed to both initiate the whole checkout arrangement before a redirect, and then after a redirect, how you can check all the webhook secrets and all the webhook security and how to read from them as well. Now, this isn't like Stripe where you have a sort of native arrangement for your local host testing. We'll need to invoke some additional third parties as such. And also, there's no real SDK as such in C# and .NET 10. There are some things that are available, but they aren't really being supported all that much, and they aren't official. So when it comes to financial things, it's probably better to avoid all the libraries that are not all that supported and not official. Better just go with direct API, which is what we will do here in this video. Now, for the setup, for the initial setup, you need to register on the sandbox business.revolut.com. That's your whole sandbox arrangement. You have this for both business API and the merchant API. If you're interested in business API, it's a bit more of a difficult setup. You need a certificate and things of that nature. So we do have another video on this channel. Take a look at that if you're interested specifically in a business API. For a merchant API, you only need API keys. You have your API secret key and your API public key. That's it. That's all you need. So we have these. Now let's get into the code. Let's look at how you set up the checkout, what kind of properties you can do, how you do the whole arrangement, what data you need to store, and then later we will get into webhooks and how we can test them on localhost. So for the payment testing here, we have quite a few inputs in the form. You can select the currency and input all kinds of things here. But let's get to the actual object that we will be sending to create a checkout URL. Essentially, the way it works, you have some data, right? Your order data, the main stuff, the value, the currency, perhaps the line items in the order, all those things. And then let's go here. You essentially want to create a checkout URL. That's where the Revolut takes over and they handle the payment, and then they send you a webhook. We'll get to those later. That's where you actually verify that you got paid for what someone ordered. So let's go here. Let's go to generate payment request. That's how we do it. And we have this new order request. Now, again, this code is available on Patreon. If you want it for reference, you can download it. Essentially, just to create an order, all you need is this class. Amount, currency. You don't need line items, you don't even need customer, nothing like that. Although having a customer will make it easier for you to invoice people. Now you can have it on your own side. It's a bit different than Stripe. In Stripe, you kind of let it handle everything as much as possible, though it can get troublesome in other ways. There is a video on this channel about Stripe, how to create basically the same checkout experience on Stripe, although that's perhaps a bit more user-friendly and smoother, so take a look at that if you're interested. But here we also have line items and we have customers. So the line items, again, this is just JSON body API request. That's what we have. Again, we're not using any SDKs, libraries, nothing like that. Just pure JSON based on Revolut's documentation. And that's why it's important to do versioning. Once we get to that, we'll talk about it a bit. So, line item. Now, line item can contain a few different things, name, quantity. It doesn't auto-calculate, so whatever you charge is in the amount above this, right, in the main object as such. Here is just for reference purposes. And you can have reference ID. So if you have a product, you know that's been paid for by that customer, and you can also do a shipping address. So we don't have that here, but you would create essentially another one of these, like line items, so shipping address perhaps based on the documentation. But this is the exact one for line item with all the options available. Now, as you can see, most of them are sort of default, or they are not necessarily needed, right? They are not required. But what is required is a type. So there's physical and there is service. There's two types. There's only two types available. But it is required. If you do add a line item, you have to add a type. And you probably have to add a name. Most of the stuff would probably be required anyways at that point, because there's no reason to add a line item without a name or anything else. And you can add reference ID, so maybe your product ID or SKU ID or whatever it is on your own database. Now, the next one is quantity. That's going into the nested basically in line item. And then we have the customer. Customer can have full name, basically for invoice purposes. We have that. The more interesting part is new order request result. This is what we will get from Revolut if the whole request is successful for the order. We get ID, we get token. Those things can be stored. It's a good idea to store everything here. It's certainly not going to hurt just for full tracking of the events in case something fails. We do have capture mode, currency, what we set. We have all these things. Now, capture mode you can set in the order request. Sometimes perhaps you want to just hold the money, perhaps you have some kind of a deposit if you're running a hotel and things of that nature, or you're depositing for some service that may not cost exactly that amount, so then you can debit whatever you need from that amount and release the rest. So just like any credit card handling, but that's more advanced topic. The main thing that we actually care about is the checkout URL. In fact, we could ignore everything else. We need the order ID to save to the database so we can compare after the webhook, but other than that, we just need checkout URL, and that's it. So we make this request. The way you do it, you saw the secret. We get that from Revolut, right? From the dashboard, the API dashboard, and we just do a very simple HTTP client. Now, whatever way you want to handle the HTTP client arrangement, you can do that. There's libraries, there's retry arrangements. We have some of those videos on the channel as well. Probably not necessarily needed. It's best to let it fail simply. If it's not reachable, just let it fail. We don't want to play around with this too much because checkout sessions do expire and all those things happen. So if it fails, just let the user know it failed and let them try again. That's probably one of the better ways to go. But again, there's all kinds of options because the request, again, is just a simple HTTP client post as JSON async. We're posting JSON body and retrieving essentially JSON response body. That's all we need to have, except for a few things. Authentication header value, your generic authentication header. Now, the header needs to be authentication header value, right? Then bearer, and then your actual secret. And then you have your version. Now, versions should be kept globally so that the webhooks, the payment service, this request, everything would have the same version. This is the latest one. Basically, they have good support, so if you keep it for a long time, it shouldn't really hurt anything, unless you perhaps go into some more complex arrangements. But for general checkout, they do have decent support time. And of course, the secret, the reason we're displaying that is for display purposes, so we can kind of compare later on, and you will see where it's used in another way as well. But of course, it should be kept in a key vault or somewhere safe, at the very least in app settings somewhere. So then we have a string result. We read that. We, just in case, this is for testing purposes, but we can read from JSON sync because we do have the object, right? The reason we have this here, we could do an else statement to make code more complicated, but it's good to have something like this when we are testing, so you don't have to run the whole process again and again if something fails, because it will return an error. If it's not success status code, it will return some error. So it can be quite useful. For example, if you wouldn't have type in the line item, it will actually say that it's missing type in the line item and it's required. So the errors are actually quite good, and just something to keep in mind. At least for the testing phase, you want to keep these around, perhaps not like this, but in another statement, you might want to leave it for later and log it as well. That's quite useful, and the errors are useful. And you don't want to do the payment again and again. And probably a good idea to leave it in production as well to some extent. Because again, how many times can you repeat the failing payment, right? Probably not get too many chances to help that user before they run away. So that's what we have. The next part is just simply getting that checkout URL. So just take the reference here, we get the result, and then we navigate to checkout URL. That's it. We do also save it, right? So for reference order ID, we need to save it, but that's it. You navigate to checkout URL, and the next step, if the payment is complete, if the payment is successful, it will send order complete, and of course it will send webhooks for canceling, but that's it. You verify and you pay. You got paid, essentially. Now, let's take a look at the webhooks. That's the actual difficult part of this whole arrangement, and let's see how they work. Before we can get exploring the webhooks, you'll need some way to actually receive the webhook on your local host. Now, to do that, there's a few options, there's a few services. With Stripe, it's very easy because they provide their own arrangement. You just download their own console application, essentially, and you run the commands there. You don't need to buy anything additional. Here, however, you don't necessarily need to buy anything additional. There is a free plan with this service called ngrok. Essentially, very simple procedure, don't overcomplicate it. Although there are a couple of steps in doing it right. You just register, you get your token, you get your URL, right, the forwarding URL, and then you write these commands. So the first one, you do want to make sure it's going to your HTTPS, because usually now from Visual Studio we launch Blazor websites on HTTPS, so it has to be that. And then you need to, of course, match your actual localhost port. If you do match everything, it should redirect all the webhooks directly to the localhost. Now, you may notice we're not doing any setup in Revolut console, whatever it may be, like we might be doing in Stripe. Well, that's because all the setup of webhooks can be and should be done via the program itself. We will have a little arrangement in program.cs in the actual Blazor app. So we will set up a webhook, and we just need this redirect arrangement for it to work. And with that, let's get into the actual controller that controls all the webhook setup and a few services related to that. So before we actually start handling the webhooks, we need to set them up, as I mentioned previously. Here we have in program.cs a little service called payments hook service, and it will run essentially every time your program as such gets restarted. So every time you deploy, redeploy, and this will work, it doesn't matter whether it's in a Docker container, in some perhaps other hosting arrangement. As long as you restart the program, it will delete the payment hooks. We have to delete them. That's very important because it will start crashing if you don't. And we have to create a new one. So let's get into create first and delete later. We have this service. We'll get to that a bit later. And then this. Now, creating payment webhook. Again, we just need to access the API. And you might notice something interesting. A lot of other services have webhook secret somewhere in the dashboard. You create that and then you paste that. But if you look at here, we just have authentication header. We need to add bearer header. We add this. which is your secret essentially, just the same as you have in the payments. So if we get here, you can see right here, it's the same exact secret. So let's get back to the webhooks. So basically you reuse that. And the way you get the webhook secret as such, you go and post to the API version 1, it's still version 1 after all these years, webhooks, and then your URL. Now, on production, of course, it would be your website and your route. In this case, we're using the ngrok, a free ngrok setup here. So that's what we're using. Of course, it would come from settings and things. And I probably shouldn't even have to mention, but I have to. The secret should be, at least in the app settings, probably in a key vault somewhere hidden and safe for demonstration purposes. We don't care. We will reset everything, wipe it out, and it's not going to be accessible by the time the video airs. But of course, in production, you want to hide it, but you can see they are the same. Now, you do need to set essentially events that you want to receive. You don't want to set random events because your API will be retrieving those events and sort of handling them at least in some way. So you don't want to overwhelm with events that don't need to be there. Now, order complete, order authorized, order cancelled, and a few other ones of these. They are essential for handling the checkout. Anything else, perhaps you need it, perhaps you don't. So for checkout, this is more than enough. It's all great to go. And then we just create essentially a webhook, we get the result, and we get the signing secret. Now, the signing secret we will be using to identify that the webhook really did come from the authorized user, from the Revolut account that's associated with you, right? So we get that secret. Again, it's the same idea as another, perhaps something like Stripe, you would create it on the dashboard. Here you create it dynamically. Quite an interesting concept, but it can be a bit more convenient even. You don't have to go back and forth via the console. And then deleting, again, the same sort of API arrangement. This is the latest version now. If it stops working, something is wrong, you can change it. But a good idea is to version everything, keep this somewhere on a global scale in your application. So everywhere the version is the same. We usually have very long support for years for these versions. So you don't go out. But again, they all have to match when you're creating a checkout. When you're handling the webhooks. So again, we pass the secret here, and then we get from JSON webhooks, nothing too much here. We use get on this one to get the hooks, right? So we get all the hooks and then we delete all the hooks. We essentially loop through all the existing hooks so we don't get all kinds of conflicts and things. We just want to get rid of all of them. Now, you may not want to get rid of all of them because these are all the webhooks that are associated with your program. So if you have some separation, perhaps you have different containers running in different places, you want to perhaps put a little database in between, or somehow make sure you're not deleting what you're not supposed to delete. So perhaps one service is running one webhook, the other is running the other. If you do it this way, you'll delete everything. So perhaps a little caching or database layer in between, just to make sure you delete the one that belongs to this actual service. But that's how you create them. That's how you delete them. And you do have to delete them, do a little cleanup. Now, let's take a look at how you actually handle the webhooks. Now, for the handling of webhooks, we just have this general route. We have a controller inside the same Blazor server application. You can certainly do that. Now, these days, you might also want to consider minimal APIs. We do have a video on that sort of quite a recent one, and a few of them, minimal APIs, validation in minimal APIs, some security in minimal APIs as well. So this is one of those arrangements where minimal API might be a good idea. However, for demonstration purposes, it's quite complicated. We're using just a simple controller, but again, it's something to consider because Blazor server app certainly doesn't necessarily need to add more files there. Although if your program.cs is already crowded, you might just consider doing this. So it depends on your preferences, really. So we have payments controller, we have webhook service and payment service. Payment service we will just use to verify the payment. We won't get into that too much. The main thing is webhook. So we have this route, payment hook, right? We have the hook body, which you can actually download this code from Patreon and you'll be able to access all this nice stuff inside here. Event, order ID, merchant. The event we use at, because event is a keyword in C#, so we have to use at, so it becomes a property name. That's how you do it. So if you wanted string as a property name, you would use at string. Of course, that's not a very good idea in general, but that's what Revolut did, so we have to do it now here. So you have your event. You saw when we were creating a webhook, we had event types. So that's the event. And then we have order ID. That's going to be the one that you saved during the checkout process. So when we create the checkout, we do order ID, and then we do we save that into the database, and then we can confirm and essentially save it. And then once we redirect somewhere, we can check that this order is paid for. That's great. Order completed, the event will be, and that's great. And then we have external reference that you see in the checkout. Okay, so we have this. That's great. Next, we need signature and timestamp. And we'll need to play around with this a bit to be able to sort of validate it, because the actual data that comes in right here, we use this when writing default, so it essentially ignores members that don't exist, and it's going to go default on that. But the actual payload, right, the data that we get, we can serialize it as this with those ignores. We have a payload and we need the JSON string for it. Now it already comes in as JSON string, and but that's how we use it in .NET and in the APIs. You take it from that, and the only reason we need to serialize it because we will need to use that in the validation. Now, the data is already there, so you don't need to really verify anything in order to read the data. However, you do need to validate what you're actually reading, because anyone can send to this webhook, right? There's no protection other than this validation. This is the most important part. This is what actually makes your payment secure. So, the validation, what you need? Payload. You need timestamp from Revolut. It's not the one you generate, right? And you need a signature from the webhook from Revolut. And they all will need to match properly. So let's get into this method here. First, you'll need to sign as SHA-256. And you'll need to compare the signature, right? This is quite interesting. First, you need the payload, and the way you do a payload, it's quite a complicated arrangement, and their documentation isn't always that great. But the payload is a string. Now, we already have a payload right here. The full payload will be v1, right? That's a version. That's a version of the signature, essentially. Then we have the timestamp. This is coming from Revolut, from the webhook headers that was sent. Then dot. Then the actual payload that was serialized. But remember, we used a certain serialization way, so you have to do that. And this code is available on Patreon if you want to take a look at that. It's a very good reference for how to use it, because again, the documentation is a bit tricky, and also it's probably not really meant for C# necessarily. So we have SHA 56. We will then take the bytes, UTF-8 bytes, from the signing secret. Remember the signing secret. This is the one that we got when we were generating a webhook. So this is the one we create rather webhook, and we retrieve the signing secret. So once we get that, we can use it to verify all the webhooks associated, or rather all the webhook endpoint requests associated with that particular webhook. If they don't match, well, then it fails. Maybe someone's trying to break in, maybe there's some error or whatever it may be. So we get the bytes from that, again, SHA 256. Using this library, this certainly works, has been tested. UTF-8, get bytes, just use this technique. It works every time. It's been verified, right? And then we look at the signature. The signature, right, will be not v1 dot, but v1 equals. So kind of different. Then we need to take the payload that we already created, right, convert it to hexadecimal string, and to lowercase. They have to be in lowercase. Then we simply take the signature here, right, from the computed hash of the SHA and compare it to the received signature, right? So we received a signature, the whole signature, and then we take all the data, assign essentially, well, we take the data and we add the signing secret to it. And from that, we derive a signature which needs to match the sent signature. That way, we verify that the data did come from our account, the order, or whatever else it might be, is legal and valid, it's what we want, and then we return true. And then we can move on to the actual validation of the payment. So moving on to that, we just validate it. Okay, it's valid. The event is order complete. So okay, we know that particular order ID is completed. Great, good. Now we can save it, and now we know the payment has been made. So this is how we deal with webhook. Again, the most difficult part really is knowing what to grab from the webhook data and also how to do the signature. The signature is very complicated. You need to do it in a certain way. You need to use a certain library. You need to use a certain hashing algorithm. So it can be quite tricky, but this is all the reference you need for it. And it works, again, it's been tested. And if you want the code, the full code is available on Patreon. Now, the other thing, the ngrok, you can use many other services. That one is relatively simple to use and it's free to get started at least. So, and you probably won't need anything more than free in those arrangements. But these are the ways to validate the payments, and you already saw how to create it. And with that said, we will conclude this video.